eno jawunyedda General Yoweri Kaguta Museveni mutabani we aba general mu UPDF ne SFC abadde bakulemberamu ekiwamba abantu ekitta abantu ekitulugunya abantu ICC America Bungereza atogamba ebigambo tebyefudde General Museveni ebyengeyenge bya zedda empale ndabada kakati zitandise okujugumira asotandike bwetuti ne munnamateeka wa Kyagulanyi Center mu Robert Bobi Wine okuva ali mu ggwanga lya America era representing omusango mu ICC agwa General Museveni omukulu Bruce Afran atugambe ebigambo.
Hello everyone, I'm glad to be back here with JB. As you know, I'm Bruce Afran and I'm Bobby Wine's attorney and the attorney for those who are filing papers in the ICC. But more broadly, I've been representing the NUP and Bobby Wine and this cause, throughout the world, talking to different people in different forums. So it's good to be here with everyone again today, and JB does a great job in running this show.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, for that. Now, getting started, on the 30th of this past month, that's April this year, the United Kingdom imposed sanctions on the Speaker of Parliament of Uganda, that is Anita Among, and 2 other former ministers for corruption and misappropriation of iron sheets meant for the poor people in Karamoja. Could you provide an insight into the legal implications and the potential consequences for the individuals involved, both in terms of their personal status and their ability to carry out their duties and functions within the government?
Well, JB, as a lawyer, sometimes people say we can't be brief, but I'll try to do both, explain and be brief as well. These sanctions are very important because it really represents the first time the UK has taken firm action against Uganda's government. Now, they didn't bring sanctions against Museveni or his son, but Speaker Among is among the highest people within the NRM and in the governing party apparatus. And this is an important statement. Now, it's interesting, JB, the parliament representative in Uganda said, oh, this is about the anti-homosexuality law. This is Britain's way of objecting to that. I don't think that's what's happening here, and I don't think Britain would bring sanctions against the Speaker of Parliament simply because of that. I think we have to look at what's really going on. They're charged with corruption about taking metal from a community construction program. I don't think the UK would get involved in that unless it was trying to send a stronger message. So first of all, JB, these sanctions are very serious. Anyone sanctioned, and the 2 ministers and Speaker Among, can no longer do any business in the UK. They can no longer send or receive any money through UK banks. They can't go to the UK or any UK territories. That will probably be honored by places like Canada and Australia as well. They are unable to do any business of any kind with anyone within the United Kingdom. So this is a very serious ban. They can't travel even to the UK. Now, for a leader in a Commonwealth country like Uganda, that's a serious burden. Now, undoubtedly, the EU will also begin to look at serious travel restraints, as will the US as to these people. Now, let's examine what's really happening here. Would the UK have done this just because of sheet metal that's taken from a community construction program? I don't think so. I think what's happening here is something more serious. You know, just last year, or early in the year, the US struck off Uganda from the AgOA, special preference for African agricultural products. And the stated reason was very blunt, because of the human rights violations. And this wasn't just a sanction against a few officials. Uganda itself is now taken out of AgOA because President Biden said its human rights record violates international law. So that's very important. So I think this is the UK's way of following on that and sending a message to Museveni and Muhoozi that we're no longer going to be tolerating this kind of conduct by Uganda. We're going to start to crack down. And I think this is the UK's way of answering both what President Biden did and what we did in the ICC. We documented hundreds of cases of torture against NUP members, against ordinary citizens. And I think the UK is now responding to that. They don't want to so directly burn the bridges yet, but they're using this sheet metal as a way of sending a signal that the worm is turning, and Museveni needs to know that.
Bruce, following the imposition of sanctions, the Uganda government stated recently its intention to engage with the United Kingdom regarding the rationale behind these actions. Now, we would love to know, is there a possibility for sanctions to be reversed, and if so, under what conditions or terms could this occur? Because if they are ready to engage, definitely, maybe there is a possibility that the sanctions can be reversed.
Well, JB, I think that's Uganda's government saying we want to talk to the UK. But the UK didn't talk to Uganda first. It issued the sanctions under the UK Global Anti-Corruption Act. So Uganda may want to talk to the UK about the rationale behind the sanctions, but that doesn't mean the UK is going to speak to Uganda. And I think that's a very important distinction. The UK would not have done this if it was prepared to negotiate and remove these later. I think the UK government would be very embarrassed if it backed out so quickly, especially when the US has sanctioned the entire agricultural industry in Uganda because of the government's human rights record. I don't think the UK is going to back down.
President of the United States, in its country report on Uganda, the United States Department of State documents the extensive crackdown on leaders and supporters of NUP by the Museveni regime. The report highlights the extrajudicial killing of NUP supporters, including Mzee Costa Muhonja, who was tortured to death in February while in police custody. It also details incidents of the abduction, torture, and detention trial of NUP supporters like Olivia Lutaya on politically motivated charges. However, the report couldn't capture all details as some are still ongoing and being documented. Like a few weeks ago, an activist by the name Masaba Faustin was abducted and still held in Communicado. Bruce, could this human rights report on Uganda support sanctions? Can it be used?
Namwe banamwe kyendaba kyemulaba ku mwana ono wizo oba banayo n'omwana wizo ayina ekintu kyayitamu bannanga ayina ekintu ekimuluma kyatasobola kwogera ate nga tuli bangi ono omwana ayina embeera gy'ayitamu bannange gye tutasobola kutegeera ever since ono omwana we yafiirwa ku mwana munne obulamu bwe bwakyuka ono omwana ayina ekintu ekimuluma ate buli wagezaako bw'ati okubanga akyogera olulimi nga lwesiba bannanga abantu abamu tugenda kufa n'ebyama nga wallahi buli weyagala bw'oti okubaako ng'ayogera
as a tool to call for sanctions. Does it meet the criteria for such action? What legal avenues could be pursued?
Well, JP, I think the report itself is a very important development. The U.S. and everyone who gave those to us, they do not go to any other government, they go to the ICC. So the U.S. was working on its own information, which was very strong as well. So I think this shows, JB, that the U.S. is now getting tougher and is going to push harder as to Uganda. And this is very significant because in next election, Uganda is going to be much harder to commit fraud and get away with it. If the Biden administration is now doing these things, withdrawing Uganda from the agricultural program, which is vital to Uganda because Uganda is an agricultural country, and then it issues a country condemning very grossly the human rights violations. I think that means that if Museveni attempts to defraud the electorate again, the United States is actually not going to accept that. Jay, these two developments are very important. removing Africa from the agricultural preference program. That's a major blow, removing Uganda. That's a major blow. It's an agricultural country. And one of the easiest things it can export is agricultural products. And that's the country report which condemns human rights violations. Now, the U.S. doesn't have all of the detail we have and that we gave to the ICC. But the U.S. report is still pretty broad and blunt and condemns Uganda's government outright. These two things tell us that the next time there's an election, it's going to coming up, Museveni is not going to be easily able to get away with committing a fraudulent election return. The U.S. is demonstrating now it's now willing to distance itself from Uganda's government, and it's not going to accept a fraudulent election. When Trump comes back, we're going to see a much tougher U.S. policy, and we may be able to see the beginning of the end of this regime. And President Biden, as we see, is also becoming tougher as well. There's less and less tolerance in the U.S. for this kind of use of government.
Yes, Bruce, could you please throw more light on the issue of using the human rights report on Uganda as a tool to call for more sanctions on targeted individuals?
Oh, yes, certainly. Thank you, JB, for reminding me on that additional issue. The report itself is the basis for sanctions in the U.S. Human rights abuses in the U.S. lead directly to sanctions. Unlike other countries, our laws allow human rights abuses to be the basis for very severe sanctions. And those include complete inability to use the U.S. banking system, and that really means the world banking system, because really the U.S. controls access to most international banks, no travel to the United States, no business in the U.S., so anyone put under those sanctions basically is out of business, and any individual or company. So the new report, the new human rights report, absolutely provides a basis for those additional sanctions. And it also tells us the U.S. is going to continue to work in that direction, because these reports are always updated. As you just pointed out, with the loss of Masaba Faustin.
Yeah, Masaba Faustin.
We see more and more cases arising, and so the U.S. pays attention to those. The next report is going to be even tougher, and so that report absolutely can be the basis for sanctions. Eventually, frankly, I think Museveni himself will be subject to those sanctions, because it's clear who is issuing the orders and who is running this operation. Now, we already identified that General Muhoozi, in three separate instances, has been identified as being the director of the government's torture operation. And that's been submitted to the ICC. That eventually can be given to the United States Department of State, and they can very seriously examine that evidence and consider sanctions against General Muhoozi. So the fact that Britain and the US are both ratcheting up the pressure, this tells us that this regime is going to be in trouble.
Yes, of course, we can see where it's heading. The sanctions, decide the human rights report on Uganda, and then the ICC. Actually, Bruce, the last time you were here, you hinted on the name Anita Mong. as one of those dragged to the International Criminal Court. Now, here comes fresh sanctions against the same person from the United Kingdom, moreover. I want you to elaborate briefly what good does this serve to the case at the ICC, because you are at the forefront of this.
Well, you know, it's interesting that on their face, the sanctions are about stealing metal. Yeah. So it doesn't directly relate to human rights abuses, but it's obviously been issued not because of the metal, but because of the human rights situation. This is the UK's way of making a starting point. And I think the ICC will understand that point. And the combination of the US and the UK sanctions and reports will, I think, be important to the ICC in evaluating this. So we'll be actually supplementing at the appropriate time our papers to bring that forward to the ICC. I think this will be very important to the ICC. Now, we also have to remember the ICC is a unique court. It doesn't have unlimited resources. It spent a great deal of time on Ukraine and still is. It's now apparently looking carefully at events in Gaza and in Israel, and with respect to the Hamas attacks as well. And so they take their time, they have to. But they are going to look at our papers, they are looking at our papers, and that process will continue. And it's a powerful tool because the leaders of Uganda know that these bodies, these courts, these governments are looking after them, out for them. And not to protect them, but the worm is turning. These leaders in Uganda are now on the defensive, and we can see that happening more and more through all of these different actions. So I believe this will be very important to the ICC because it shows an international trend, and that's important as well.
Of course, why all this is happening is because our courts are under the pocket of Mr. Museveni. He decides who goes to prison, who comes out, and all that kind of thing. The sanctions and the pressure from those that support him, from those that finance him, that pressure will do something. Now, Bruce, there is a perception in the media that once the United Kingdom imposes sanctions on an individual, it is likely that other countries such as the USA, Canada, and Europe may follow suit. Actually, in your previous submission, you hinted on it as well. So could you elaborate more on the visibility of it happening and what role Uganda can play to influence such actions? Because I tell you, Ugandans would love Canada, USA, Europe, and all the neighboring countries slapping sanctions these officials that violate the rights of Ugandans?
Thank you, JB. I think that's an important question. First of all, I think the EU and Canada and maybe Australia and countries like that will certainly be giving serious thought to sanctions.
Great, because people are really committed, and I'm very sure very many who did not know about this are going to start on it as allies are today. Now, Bruce, there is this one, of course, about sanctioning juniors and leaving the master untouched. Yes, Ugandans are complaining, and actually, I think they do have a valid point. They argue that it is unfair to sanction the juniors and leave the master untouched. Are there any precedents or legal frameworks that could be applied in the case of Museveni? Should there be a concerted effort to sanction him? How might such efforts be viewed in the broader context of international law and diplomacy?
Well, I don't think people should be frustrated that the junior people are being attacked. First of all, the speaker is not junior. She's an important figure in the government. I think what's important to remember is that this is happening and is growing. That's the point. You know, you start smaller and you get bigger. So it's natural these governments will send a message focusing on some of the lower ranking people. Eventually that message will have to go higher and higher, and will eventually reach those who are truly in charge of the abuses. So people should not be disappointed. You know, everyone likes to complain. That's true, right, JP? I mean, let's face it. In politics, everyone wants to complain. But you got to look at what's really happening here. What's really happening is a change in the attitude of the US and the UK, especially the UK. And the UK used to hold back and give Uganda a free hand because the UK had an old colonial interest there and sort of wanted to recapture that. But now the UK is being tougher. Going after the speaker was a big gesture. It's not a small gesture. It's not going after a junior. It's sending a message. People need to know the work we've done and are doing is taking root internationally. President Biden started off backing off on criticizing Museveni, but not anymore. Now we see he's cut out Uganda from the trade group, and they issued a direct, strong country report condemning broad human rights abuses, not by junior officials, but by the government that Museveni runs. These are big steps, so people in Uganda need to see it that way. And remember, things take a little time, but these are big steps, and they're growing out of what we started. What we started with the ICC and our international press conferences. So people need to remember those are big steps. But really, freedom is not won by complaining. You know, freedom's won by doing and taking action. You know, complaining might make you feel good, but it's not going to do anything. People need to start to say to themselves, I'll take action. I need to do that. And groups need to take action. And then eventually things change. Because there are still decent people in Uganda's government. And once the Ugandan people stand up, those people will begin to be stronger. And so it's important for people to gain liberty on their own. It can't only be done from the outside. It's got to be done from the inside too. And the first step, JB, is to stop complaining. Do. Don't complain, do.
Yes, Bruce, still on that note, what can you say about the issue of Museveni not sanctioned yet?
I'd say the word yet is right there. Eventually it will happen. And it has happened to leaders. It's happened to Putin. It happened to the leader of Serbia, who was actually not only sanctioned, but thrown in prison eventually. So eventually those sanctions will touch ground and where we want them to. This is a big step. And I will stress, JB, Britain going after the speaker and 2 ministers or former ministers, that is not small. Those are high-ranking officials. The U.S. issuing that country report is not small. It's a governmental condemnation of Uganda's government. And people need to realize, with the U.S. such a big military supporter of Uganda, for the U.S. to issue that report condemning Museveni's government, that is not small. That is big. And I think people in Uganda need to realize the work we've done is starting to take root. But Ugandans need to do that work too. Bobby's doing it, NUP people are doing it. We need ordinary Ugandans also to do it.
Yes, Bruce, as we wind up the show, let us also say something about AgOA. You and me both know at the start of this year, actually it was the 1st of January 2024, Uganda was suspended from AgOA due to its human rights record under Museveni. But of course, just like, dictators, Museveni is not going to fold his arms. He's going to fight back. And on this note, concerning individuals illegally representing Uganda to reinstate AgOA, Museveni, that is Museveni, to cut deals and reinstate AgOA. But recently, he appointed the Oliver Kamanzi, who is representing the government of Uganda, without being registered with the Department of Justice FARA office. I want you to expound on this and explain very well, because these people, they are illegally representing Uganda. They are being presented as trade representatives, but they are not registered by FARA. So, what actions can be taken in response to this? Because this is really very serious.
Well, certainly if someone's representing Uganda as a private citizen in the U.S., but isn't registering, that's a criminal offense in the United States.
Yes. Mm.
And that could be prosecuted, it can be brought to the attention of the Justice Department. We can do that. That would be an important step to take. But remember, we also don't want to cut off all communication. It's important that people speak to our government here and tell Museveni the way it is. Because no one in our government is going to close their eyes anymore to torture or human rights abuses. So when Museveni sends someone here or asks someone here to speak for him, they're going to get an honest answer from the United States, and Museveni is going to hear that. And so it's important that he hear that message. So it's not wrong that someone speaks to the government for Museveni. In a sense, we want that to happen. We want that message to be sent back to Uganda. But I think the fact that he's using people who are in the U.S. also shows that it's dangerous for Ugandan officials to leave the country, because they never know if the ICC has an indictment against them. And they never know whether or not the U.S. or some other country is going to bring some sort of charges against them. So the fact that he had to use someone in the U.S. who needed to register actually tells us that they're unwilling to send people here sometimes because they're fearful of what may happen to them. So I think we're making inroads into the government.
Bruce, as we wind up today's show, this is the last one. It's about different forms of sanctions. There are various forms. Could you explain to our viewers today the best choice, especially in the fight against dictators like Museveni?
I'm not an absolute expert on sanctions, of course, but I am a lawyer and I'm very well versed in international law and U.S. law in general. Sanctions in the U.S. for human rights violations are very, very broad. When someone is sanctioned in that way, they're blocked from the banking system. And that's huge, because the banking system of the U.S. is the world banking system. If you can't get onto the U.S. banking system, there's very little you can do. Travel is banned to the U.S. Once the U.S. bans travel of a high Ugandan official under our sanctions, that's going to take root elsewhere. And so more and more of those options of Ugandan officials are going to narrow once we impose sanctions. No business can be done under these sanctions. the United States. All accounts in the US of the sanctioned person are frozen. These are very powerful tools, and different dimensions of them can be used, but I've described a range of sanctions. In general, though, when someone is sanctioned for violating human rights, all of these kick in. I hope people will not only listen and watch this show, but send it on to others and bring others together to listen. I know not everyone has a smartphone or a computer, but bring people together to listen to this show. When you hear JB's show, go get 10 people to listen. And everyone in Uganda should be doing that so that these messages really are heard through the entire nation. So thank you, JB, for doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for honoring our invitation for today's show. It has been a great time having you on the show again. Till next time, thank you. And to whoever has been watching this talk show, please, thank you very much. Keep pushing it, keep pressing that share button. You can trim it in parts and share in your WhatsApp groups, YouTube channels, TikTok, everywhere. Spread the message. Thank you.
Bruce African ye munnamateeka wa president Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine okuva mu ggwanga lya America. Ensonga azitemetemye bulungi oziwulidde era zigguse. Ono kimanye General Museveni Yamulagula yasiridde dda essaawa yonna ebigambo bikyuka. Omunnayuganda kimanye nti ekyola bakikwasa engalo. General